For over 100 years, one question has quietly divided historians, anthropologists, and everyday families across East Asia, and it has never fully gone away. Think about how strange that actually is. Most countries settle their founding stories fairly early, wrap them in a bit of poetry, and move on. But this particular question kept resurfacing, generation after generation, in classrooms, in academic journals, in family dinner conversations, because the stakes attached to it were never just academic. They were personal. They touched on who counted as a real descendant of a civilization, whose ancestors deserved credit for one of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth, and whether that culture had grown entirely on its own or had, in some sense, been handed down from somewhere else. For a question with that much emotional weight riding on it, it's remarkable how long it went completely untested. Where did the Chinese people actually come from? Not in the vague, textbook sense of ancient China had rivers and rice, but in the deeper sense, the blood sense, the ancestry sense. Was the civilization that rose along the Yellow River something that grew up entirely on its own soil, untouched by outside hands, or was it, as some scholars once insisted with total confidence, planted by travelers from a much older civilization thousands of miles away? For decades, this wasn't just a fringe-rumor. It was taught in universities. It was printed in serious academic journals. And it split families and scholars into camps that genuinely believed the other side was rewriting history for the wrong reasons. Then, over the last 20 years, something changed. Scientists finally had the tools to stop arguing and start testing. They pulled ancient bones out of caves in northern China, out of riverbanks, out of burial sites untouched for thousands of years, and they read the genetic code hidden inside them like a diary nobody was ever supposed to open. What they found didn't just answer the question that had been debated for a century. It uncovered something far stranger sitting underneath it, a second mystery that the first one had been quietly hiding all along. Before we get to what the DNA actually showed, it's worth sitting with the three big stories people told themselves for generations, because none of them came from nowhere. Each one made real sense to the people who believed it, and each one shaped how millions of people understood their own family line. And it's worth being honest about something up front. None of these three stories were dreamed up by fools. Each one was believed at some point by serious, well-educated people who were doing the best they could with the tools available to them at the time. Before genetics existed as a science, the only evidence anyone had to work with was language, pottery, old texts, and folk memory. And all three of those tools can be bent to tell almost any story you already want to believe. That's not a criticism of the people who believe these stories. It's just a reminder of how much harder it used to be to actually know rather than simply guess where people came from. The first story is the oldest, and it isn't really a scientific theory at all. It's a myth, but a myth that functioned like ancestry for thousands of years. According to Chinese legend, nearly every person of Han Chinese descent traces back to two legendary rulers, Wang Di, known as the Yellow Emperor, and Yan Di, the Flame Emperor, who are said to have lived around 4,600 years ago and either fought each other or joined forces, depending on which version of the story you were told as a child. For most of Chinese history, calling yourself a descendant of Yan Di and Huang Di wasn't just poetry. It was treated as a literal genealogical claim, the way some Western families used to insist they were descended from a specific medieval king. It gave an enormous, sprawling population spread across mountains, rivers, and coastlines, one shared origin point, one bloodline, one family tree with two roots at the very top. It's easy to understand why this story held on for so long. It's simple, it's proud, and it gives millions of people belonging to a single continuous story instead of feeling like scattered strangers who happen to end up on the same landmass. Even today, the phrase descendants of Yan Di and Huang Di shows up in speeches and textbooks and in ordinary conversation, not because anyone is running a genealogy chart in their head, but because it functions as a kind of shorthand for belonging, the same way people in other cultures might describe themselves as children of the soil or sons of the founding fathers, without meaning it as a literal biological claim. The story survived for 4,600 years, not because anyone could prove it, but because nobody had a way to disprove it either. It simply sat there, unquestioned, doing the emotional work that origin stories are built to do. The second story came from inside the world of science itself, or at least what passed for science in the early 20th century, and it's the one that got tangled up with real archaeology in a way that took decades to unravel. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, a French scholar named Terrien de Lacouperie put forward an idea that sounds almost unbelievable today, but was taken completely seriously by many Western academics at the time. He argued that Chinese civilization wasn't homegrown at all. He claimed that the legendary Yellow Emperor was actually a Mesopotamian ruler named Nekhunte, who supposedly led a group of Babylonian settlers on a long migration eastward, bringing writing, bronze working, and organized government with them into the Yellow River Valley. In other words, According to this theory, the entire foundation of Chinese civilization was really just an outpost of a much older Middle Eastern one planted on the other side of the continent. This idea was taken so seriously that it was debated in academic journals for years, and some Chinese reformers in the early 20th century even embraced parts of it, because at the time, tying Chinese civilization to the same ancient lineage as Mesopotamia and the biblical world felt like it gave China a seat at the table of what Western scholars considered the great ancient civilizations. It came from a real, understandable impulse, a desire to connect one's own history to the deepest, most celebrated root of civilization that Western academia recognized at the time. Part of what made this theory so persuasive to people at the time was that it wasn't built purely on wishful thinking. Its supporters pointed to real, surface-level similarities, things like shared symbols in early writing systems, comparable myths about floods and great rulers, and similar-sounding words scattered across ancient languages thousands of miles apart. To someone standing in the early 1900s without any way to test a bone or read a genome, those similarities looked like solid clues, breadcrumbs leading back to a single point of origin. It's only with the benefit of much more complete archaeology and eventually genetics that scholars were able to show those similarities were mostly coincidence, independent invention, or the kind of loose pattern matching that can connect almost any two ancient cultures if you squint hard enough. At the time, though, it felt like real evidence, and that's exactly why so many serious people signed on to it. The third story is the quietest one, but in some ways the most emotionally powerful because it isn't about a foreign origin at all, so it's about the opposite. Through much of the 20th century, a genuinely popular scientific idea held that the ancestors of modern Chinese people had been living in that same region of Asia for an almost unimaginably long time, stretching back not just thousands of years, but hundreds of thousands of years, directly descended from an ancient human ancestor known as Peking Man, whose fossils were discovered in a cave near Beijing in the 1920s. This idea, sometimes called regional continuity, suggested that different populations of ancient humans evolved somewhat separately in different parts of the world, each one gradually turning into the modern populations that live there today. Under this view, the people of East Asia weren't recent arrivals from anywhere. They were, in a sense, always there, the direct genetic heirs of ancient hominins who had walked the same ground for hundreds of thousands of years. For a long time, this wasn't a fringe belief. It was published, taught, and defended by serious scientists, and it's easy to see why it resonated so deeply. It offered an almost unbroken thread connecting the deep past directly to the present, without a single outside migration ever needed. There's also something worth noticing about why this particular theory felt so satisfying compared to the other two. It didn't require anyone to imagine a foreign founder or a legendary emperor arriving from somewhere else. It simply said, in effect, the people here have always been here, going back further than anyone could reasonably measure. For a region with one of the longest continuously written histories on the planet, an idea like that lines up almost too perfectly with how the culture already saw itself. A civilization that didn't need to borrow its origins from anywhere, because it had never really gone anywhere in the first place. So there they are, a divine dual bloodline running back to two legendary emperors, a foreign seed planted by Babylonian travelers, and an unbroken local thread running back hundreds of thousands of years to Peking Man. Three completely different pictures of the same people, each one believed with total sincerity by different generations, and each one impossible to fully test using old world tools like pottery styles, language comparisons, or ancient texts alone. Then geneticists opened up the genome. Once the scientists were able to sequence not just the DNA of living people, but the DNA preserved in ancient bones, this stopped being a debate about legends and started being a debate about evidence you could actually measure. Researchers studying ancient remains from sites across northern China, including a cave near Beijing that had preserved the bones of a man who lived roughly 40,000 years ago, were able to read long stretches of genetic code straight out of that ancient skeleton. Around the same world, teams working with East Asian genetic databases gathered DNA from tens of thousands of living people across China, comparing shared patterns passed down over thousands of generations. And in the wider field of ancient DNA research, scientists have spent the last 2 decades building a genetic map of ancient populations from Mesopotamia, Egypt, Europe, and the Americas, which finally made it possible to do something nobody could do before. Take DNA linked to real ancient civilizations from around the globe and directly compare it, piece by piece, against the deep ancestry of the people living in East Asia today. Before we get into what that comparison found, it helps to understand, in the simplest possible terms, what these scientists were actually reading. Every person's DNA is a long chain of chemical instructions, and small differences in that chain get passed down from parent to child, generation after generation, almost like a very long, very slowly changing family recipe. Most of that recipe is identical across every human being on the planet, no matter where their ancestors are from. In fact, when you compare any two random people anywhere in the world, the overwhelming majority of their DNA is exactly the same, and almost every meaningful difference between them comes down to them simply being different people, not different ethnic groups. The differences scientists care about for questions like this one are tiny, subtle patterns buried inside that shared recipe, patterns that tend to travel together in specific regions because people in the same area married, had children, and passed those patterns down together for thousands of years. When a population has been isolated in one place for a very long time, or has mixed with a very specific set of neighboring populations, those patterns leave a kind of fingerprint. That fingerprint is what researchers were comparing. Not something as simple or crude as skin color or facial features, but deep statistical patterns buried in thousands of tiny genetic markers. Patterns that can only be explained by tracing exactly which populations mixed with which other populations, and roughly when. To build a picture like this, researchers don't rely on a single sample or a single lucky discovery. They gather genetic material from dozens of ancient burial sites, sequence it using specialized laboratory techniques designed to work with damaged, degraded DNA that's been sitting in the ground for thousands of years, and then compare it statistically against both other ancient samples and large modern databases containing genetic information from tens of thousands of living volunteers across different regions. It's slow, careful, unglamorous work, closer to painstaking accounting than to the dramatic movie version of a lab discovery, but it's exactly that kind of patient, repeated comparison that lets scientists say with real confidence how one ancient population relates to another, rather than just guessing based on old maps and older assumptions. It also helps to understand just how difficult it actually is to pull usable DNA out of a bone that's been sitting in the ground for tens of thousands of years. Over that much time, DNA doesn't sit there perfectly preserved, waiting patiently to be read. It breaks down into tiny damaged fragments, gets contaminated by bacteria and fungi that have been living in that same soil for just as long, and often ends up so degraded that, for decades, most scientists assumed genetic material that old simply couldn't be recovered at all. It took years of new laboratory methods, developed specifically for working with ancient, damaged samples, before researchers could reliably tell the difference between genuine ancient human DNA and the environmental contamination surrounding it, and before they could stitch together enough tiny broken fragments to reconstruct a usable picture of someone's ancestry. That difficulty is worth remembering, because it's part of why this entire debate stayed unresolved for so long. It wasn't that scientists. For almost 500 years, one question about the Maya has refused to go away. How did a people living in the middle of a tropical jungle with no wheels, no metal tools, and no draft animals build cities with pyramids taller than a 15-story building, invent one of the most accurate calendars in the ancient world, and develop a full written language, all seemingly out of nowhere? For centuries, explorers, priests, and even trained scientists looked at those ruins rising out of the jungle canopy and came to the same uncomfortable conclusion. Surely, they thought, a people this advanced couldn't have done it alone. Someone else must have helped them, or come before them, or given them the spark. That single, quiet assumption would go on to shape hundreds of years of guesswork, legend, and outright fantasy about who the Maya really were and where their bloodline actually came from. And now, after decades of digging through both ruins and genomes, scientists have finally gotten a direct answer from the one witness who was there the whole time and never lied: the DNA itself. What it revealed didn't just settle the argument. It uncovered something far stranger, sitting quietly underneath the mystery the whole time, something involving twins, a sacred myth, and a chamber of children that nobody expected to find. Long before anyone could read a single strand of DNA, people needed an explanation for the Maya, and in the absence of evidence, they built one out of the stories, religions, and assumptions they already carried with them. The first of these explanations came from Spanish priests and colonial writers in the 1500s and 1600s, and it's one that still shows up today. It's the idea that the Maya, along with other indigenous peoples of the Americas, were actually descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. To modern ears, this sounds strange, but at the time it made a certain kind of sense to the people proposing it. European scholars of that era believed the entire human story was contained inside the Bible, and the Bible describes 10 tribes of ancient Israelites who were exiled and scattered and never heard from again. When Spanish missionaries encountered Maya pyramids, sacred texts, purification rituals, and a complex religious calendar, some of them genuinely believed they were looking at the descendants of those missing tribes, wandered impossibly far from home, and changed by centuries in a new land. It wasn't meant as an insult. In a worldview where every human being had to trace back to figures in Genesis, this theory was actually their way of trying to fit the Maya into a story of shared humanity, rather than dismiss them as something separate entirely. The second explanation came later as archaeology became a real discipline in the 1800s and 1900s, and it centered on the pyramids themselves. Explorers looked at Maya step pyramids, and then they looked at pictures of Egyptian pyramids, and the visual similarity was hard to shake. Both civilizations built enormous stone structures with a triangular shape. Both tracked the stars with obsessive precision. Both mummified or specially treated important remains. Both had hierarchical societies ruled by a king tritatus divine. To some serious scholars of the time, and to a much larger number of popular writers, it seemed almost impossible that two civilizations on opposite sides of the planet, with no ships capable of an ocean crossing between them, could have invented such similar ideas completely independently. So the theory grew that there must have been some kind of contact, some lost sailors, some transatlantic connection, some shared root civilization, maybe even the legendary lost continent of Atlantis, that seeded advanced building knowledge into both Egypt and Mesoamerica. It's a theory built on a real and genuinely striking coincidence, and that's exactly why it stuck around for so long. The third explanation is the strangest of the three, but it grew out of the same basic instinct as the other two. In the 1960s, a Swiss writer named Erich von Däniken published a wildly popular book proposing that many of the world's ancient monuments, pyramids, and religious symbols were actually built with help from visiting extraterrestrials. One of his most famous pieces of evidence was a carved stone lid from the tomb of a Maya king named Pakal, found inside a pyramid at the site of Palenque. Von Däniken looked at the intricate carving on that lid, showing the king positioned amid swirling symbolic patterns, representing his descent into the underworld, and argued it actually depicted an astronaut sitting inside a rocket ship, complete with control panels and an exhaust flame. To millions of readers around the world, in an era freshly obsessed with the space race and UFO sightings, this idea landed perfectly. It offered a tidy explanation for something that otherwise felt almost too advanced to believe humans alone could have pulled off, and it turned a real sacred piece of Maya religious art into evidence for visitors from another planet. All three of those explanations share the exact same quiet assumption sitting underneath them, whether their believers ever said it out loud or not. Each one assumes the Maya couldn't have built what they built, or thought what they thought, purely as themselves, using their own minds, their own labor, and their own cultural evolution across thousands of years. Each theory reaches outward, to Israel, to Egypt, to the stars, instead of simply trusting the people who were standing right there the whole time. And every single one of those stories has now been tested directly against real ancient DNA pulled from actual Maya remains, and every one of them has failed the test completely. To understand why, you have to go back to how scientists actually read this kind of ancient evidence in the first place, because it isn't magic and it isn't guesswork. It starts with something called DNA, which is basically an incredibly long instruction manual made of a chemical code that sits inside almost every cell in your body and tells that cell how to build and run itself. You inherit half of that instruction manual from each of your parents, and they inherited theirs from their parents before them, all the way back through an unbroken chain stretching to the very first humans. That means your DNA isn't just about you. It's a kind of living record, a copy of a copy of a copy, carrying tiny fingerprints of everyone who came before you in that chain. When scientists want to know where a group of people actually came from, they don't have to rely on old stories or educated guesses anymore. They can pull DNA directly out of ancient bones and teeth, some of them 1,000 years old or more, and read the code itself. Before we even get to the Maya specifically, it helps to understand the bigger journey their ancestors were part of, because that journey is really the backbone of this entire mystery. Somewhere around 20,000 years ago, during the depths of the last ice age, so much of the planet's water was locked up in glaciers that sea levels around the world dropped dramatically, low enough to expose a wide stretch of land connecting Siberia to Alaska. A land bridge scientists now call Beringia. It wasn't a bridge in the sense of a narrow strip of pavement. It was an entire landscape, hundreds of miles wide in places, with its own grasses, its own rivers, and its own animals, and small bands of hunter-gatherers appear to have lived on it and slowly moved across it over the course of many generations, long before anyone thought of themselves as crossing between two continents at all. Eventually, as the ice sheets blocking the way further south began to retreat, these small founding populations pushed onward, spreading out across North America, then Central America, then all the way down into South America, reaching the southern tip of the continent within just a few thousand years. An extraordinarily fast migration across two entire continents when you consider they were doing it on foot, with none of the tools we'd normally associate with rapid long-distance travel. The ancestors of the Maya were part of that same wave, eventually settling into the region we now call the Yucatan Peninsula and the highlands of what is today Guatemala, choosing a landscape of thick tropical forest, limestone caves, and seasonal rainfall that would shape almost everything about how their civilization eventually developed. This is the part of the story a genome can reconstruct with real confidence, because that founding population carried a genetic signature that is genuinely rare and distinctive, one that simply doesn't exist in West Asia, North Africa, or the Mediterranean. And that distinctiveness is exactly what makes the DNA evidence in this case so unusually clean. Over the last 2 decades, teams of geneticists working with archaeologists across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras have done exactly that, extracting and sequencing genetic material from dozens of ancient Maya individuals buried in tombs, temples, and ceremonial sites across the region, spanning well over 1,000 years of history. This kind of research typically appears in major international science journals, reviewed carefully by other experts in the field before publication, and it draws on modern laboratory techniques capable of reading genetic fragments so old and so damaged that just 20 years ago, this kind of study would have been considered nearly impossible. Pulling usable genetic code out of bones that old is not simple work. Most ancient DNA is badly broken down, chopped into tiny fragments by 1,000 years of heat, moisture, and bacteria, so scientists have to piece together those fragments, almost like reassembling a shredded letter, using powerful computers to match overlapping pieces back into areatable order. They also have to be extremely careful about contamination, since a single stray skin cell from a modern researcher's finger could ruin an entire sample, which is why this kind of work is done in specially sealed, clean laboratories built just for ancient DNA. Once a usable genetic code is recovered, scientists compare it against enormous public databases containing genetic information from thousands of people across almost every population on Earth today, along with other ancient samples recovered from digs on nearly every continent. The comparison lets them see which populations, ancient or modern, look most similar to each other, in the same way you might compare 2 family photo albums and notice which 2 families keep showing up with the same eyes, the same jawline, or the same rare birthmark passed down through generations. And when scientists lined up that ancient Maya genetic code next to genetic samples from populations all across the globe, including modern populations in Israel, Egypt, and everywhere in between, the picture that came back was completely consistent and completely clear. The ancestry of the Maya traces directly back to a founding population that crossed from Siberia into the Americas across an ancient land bridge, sometime between roughly 15 and 20,000 years ago, long before Egypt existed, long before the tribes of Israel existed, and unmistakably from an East Asian and Siberian genetic lineage rather than a Near Eastern or Mediterranean one. One reason this ancestry shows up so clearly, rather than as a blurry mix of everything, comes down to something geneticists call a founder effect, and it's easier to picture than it sounds. Imagine an enormous jar filled with 1,000 different colored marbles, representing all the genetic variety present in the wider human population of Asia at the time. Now imagine only a small handful of those marbles, say a few dozen, get scooped out and carried across Beringia into a brand new, completely empty landscape, with no other marbles able to get in from anywhere else for thousands of years afterward. Whatever mix of colors happened to be in that handful is now the entire starting palette for every single population that grows from it, generation after generation, isolated from the rest of the jar completely. That's essentially what happened to the earliest people entering the Americas, and it's why their descendants, including the eventual ancestors of the Maya, carry a genetic signature that stands out so distinctly from populations in Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. It isn't that their DNA is more special or more unusual in some mystical sense. It's simply that a small specific starting sample, isolated for thousands of years, naturally stays statistically distinct from the much larger, more mixed populations it's separated from. It's worth pausing here to notice something important before we go through each theory one by one. None of these 3 folk explanations were foolish for the era they came from. Each one was built by genuinely curious people working with the only tools they had, which were their own religious frameworks, their own visual comparisons, and their own sense of what seemed physically possible at the time. The problem was never that these people were careless thinkers. The problem was that none of them had access to the one kind of evidence that could actually settle the question, which is a direct read of the biological record itself. That's exactly what changed once ancient DNA entered the picture, and it's why the same 3 old theories now have to be measured against a kind of evidence nobody in the 1500s, the 1800s, or even the 1960s could possibly have checked. Let's take the lost tribes of Israel theory first, because the math on this one is almost embarrassingly simple once you see it laid out. Genetic markers act almost like an inherited passport stamp, passed down largely unchanged for many, many generations, and the stamps carried by ancient Israelite populations look nothing at all like the stamps carried by ancient Maya remains. If 10 tribes of Israelites had truly traveled across Asia, and into North America a few thousand years ago, and then intermarried into the existing population enough to become the ancestors of the entire Maya civilization, their genetic fingerprint would still be sitting right there in the DNA, the way a single dye poured into a swimming pool still tints the whole pool a slightly different color. Instead, there's no trace of West Asian or Mediterranean ancestry at all in the ancient Maya genome, not a light dusting, not a hint, nothing. Every single marker points cleanly back towards Siberia and East Asia. It would be like searching a house from top to bottom for a coffee stain you were absolutely certain must be there, only to discover the carpet has never once had coffee spilled on it in its entire history. It's also worth remembering that this particular theory didn't stay stuck in the 1500s. It resurfaced again in the 1800s and 1900s in various religious movements across the Americas, and versions of it are still repeated today by some writers who point to similarities between Maya purification rituals, calendar systems, or architectural details and practices described in the Old Testament. But similarity of practice is not the same thing as shared ancestry. And this is actually one of the most important lessons hiding inside this entire mystery. Lots of unrelated human societies, completely isolated from each other, have independently developed rituals involving purification, sacred calendars, and monumental architecture, simply because these are common, recurring solutions to common, recurring human needs, tracking the seasons, marking the passage of time, and building shared religious meaning around powerful, monumental spaces. Shared behavior across cultures is common. Shared DNA across cultures with no possible route of contact is not, and only one of those two things can actually be tested directly in a laboratory. Now, take the Egyptian and Atlantis theory, and this time the problem isn't really about ancestry markers at all, it's about something even more basic: timing and geography. Ancient DNA doesn't just tell scientists who a population is related to, it also lets them build a timeline, tracing roughly when different groups split apart from each other and when, if ever, they mixed back together. That timeline shows the ancestors of the Maya arriving in the Americas, and then living in almost total genetic isolation from the rest of the world for somewhere around 15,000 years, with no meaningful evidence of outside genetic contact until European colonization beginning in the 1500s. Egyptian civilization, meanwhile, didn't even begin until roughly 5,000 years ago. That means the ancestors of the Maya had already been living completely separately from Africa, Europe, and Asia for a full 10,000 years before the first Egyptian pyramid was ever built. There was no ancient transatlantic bridge quietly connecting the two civilizations in the DNA, because there was no biological contact for the DNA to record in the first place. Picture two families moving into completely separate, sealed-off islands with absolutely no boats and no way to visit each other. And then imagine someone claiming, 10,000 years later, that they must have been secretly throwing dinner parties together the entire time. The isolation in the genetic record simply doesn't allow for it. As for the pyramid shape itself, that similarity turns out to have a much simpler explanation than a shared origin, once you think about the actual engineering problem both civilizations were solving. If you want to build the tallest, most awe-inspiring stone structure possible, using nothing but simple hand tools, ramps, and human labor, without the benefit of modern steel supports, a wide, sloped, pyramid-shaped base is one of the most stable and structurally forgiving shapes available, since it spreads an enormous amount of weight downward and outward instead of concentrating it dangerously at the top. Civilizations separated by entire oceans with no possible contact between them have independently arrived at that same basic shape again and again throughout history. Not because they secretly copied each other, but because it's simply one of the most obvious solutions to the same physical problem. The same way societies on opposite sides of the planet independently invented the wheel, the bow and arrow, and systems of counting, without ever meeting each other even once. And then there's the ancient astronaut theory, which doesn't really involve a genetic ancestry claim at all, since nobody has seriously proposed extraterrestrials contributed actual DNA to the Maya bloodline. But the ancient DNA research quietly undermines the theory anyway, in a different way. Genetic studies of Maya remains show a clear, steady, unbroken population living and developing in the same region across many centuries, generation folding into generation, with no sudden genetic disruption. No unexplained new population suddenly appearing out of nowhere, and no mysterious gap in the historical and biological record where an outside influence would need to have stepped in. The evidence instead shows exactly what you'd expect from a purely human civilization slowly building knowledge across dozens of generations, refining its mathematics, its astronomy, its architecture, and its writing system bit by bit over well over 1,000 years, the same way every other great civilization on Earth built its own achievements without any outside help. The pyramids weren't a shortcut handed down from the stars. They were the accumulated work of an unbroken human population that had well over 1,000 years to practice, fail, refine, and finally get it right. Archaeologists can actually watch this slow buildup happen directly in the layers of construction at sites across the Maya world. The same way you can watch a tree's age recorded in its own growth rings. Early versions of Maya pyramids tend to be smaller, simpler, and less precisely aligned with the movements of the sun and stars. Later versions, built by descendants of those same earlier builders centuries afterward, grow taller, more architecturally ambitious, and dramatically more precise in their astronomical alignment, to the point where certain temple staircases were positioned so that sunlight creates the illusion of a serpent slithering down the steps on specific calendar days tied to the planting season. That kind of steady, generational refinement is exactly the fingerprint of ordinary human learning, passed down from teacher to student, parent to child, master builder to apprentice, across an unbroken population, rather than a sudden, unexplained leap that a single outside visit might produce. If extraterrestrials, or any other outside group, had simply handed the Maya finished blueprints, you would expect the earliest structures to already look almost as advanced as the latest ones. Instead, the record shows exactly the opposite, a civilization visibly teaching itself, 1 century at a time. So by every genetic measure that scientists can test, the case is closed on where the Maya bloodline actually comes from. It's Siberian and East Asian in its deepest roots, arriving in the Americas alongside the very first people to ever set foot on this continent, then developing in place entirely on its own for thousands of years. That part of the mystery, the part people have been arguing about since the 1500s, has a clean, confident, well-supported answer. And you would think that would be the end of the story. It should be a satisfying place to stop. Except that right in the middle of confirming that answer, researchers ran into something they were not expecting at all. Something that had nothing to do with Israel, or Egypt, or outer space, and everything to do with a piece of Maya religious mythology that suddenly turned out to be uncomfortably, hauntingly literal. The discovery happened at one of the most famous Maya sites in the entire world, Chichen Itza, in the Yucatan Peninsula of modern-day Mexico, a city so iconic that its central pyramid is recognized today as one of the new 7 wonders of the world. Beneath the site, archaeologists had long known about a network of underground chambers called chaltuns, originally built to store rainwater in a region with very little surface water, but later repurposed for